welcome back after what seems like probably quite a short break in this jam-packed program, but we're sort of slowly, we're not winding down for the day, but we can see the end of the day in sight. But I'm really thrilled to introduce this panel to be chaired by, I was thinking how many of the presenters are dear friends and colleagues, but Louise and I are both really thrilled that Kim Rubenstein agreed to chair this particular panel. Kim is a co-director of a foundation at the University of Canberra, 50-50 by 2030. So lots of numbers in that title. And Kim's also a professor of law at the University of Canberra, and she was for a long time where we were colleagues at the ANU. And this is another of these panels when we're combining the wisdom and experience of somebody like Kim with some newer voices. And I'm really grateful, Kim, that you took this on, and I'm now delighted to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Hilary, and thank you to you and Louise for a splendid day so far. We are into the tail end of the afternoon, but I certainly feel the energy and the passion of the day, which is going to help us move forward. And in fact, the title of this session is called Moving Forward in an Era of Backlash. And the two papers that I've been privileged to see in advance of all of the participants are by Sanam Amin from the University of Melbourne and Shalu Nigam, who is an independent researcher. And both of these papers, which I will come back to after we've heard them, are inspiring, I think, in terms of the visions and the sobering reminders of the way forward, how we move forward in a time of backlash. And before we go to those papers, I did want to take us back a little, even back earlier than 1995, because of the term backlash, which is in this particular title. And behind me in the bookshelves, I've actually brought out this particular book, which I purchased in 1991, directly from Susan Faludi, the author. This is the book that, in my own consciousness, the term backlash was made ever present to me in looking at this book. I was doing my graduate work over in the United States in 1991, and this book was seen as a significant book, as a wake-up call to men and women struggling to build a gender-respectful society. And that was the first time I started to think about the concept of backlash. But it was also, as I said, at a time when I was doing my own graduate work, and I was in my mid-20s. And while I was living there, I went to see a film which had a profound impact on me, also released in 1991, called Raise the Red Lantern. And I don't know if many of you have seen it, but I would encourage you not only to read Susan Faludi's book, of course, but to see the film Raise the Red Lantern. It was directed, it's a Chinese film directed by Zhang Yimou, and it was an adaptation of a book called Wives and Concubines by Su Tong. And the film represented a young woman who was well educated, but whose father had died, and the family scenario required her to go and become the fourth wife to a Chinese emperor. And I remember sitting on my own in a cinema in Washington, DC, as a woman in her mid-20s, developing my own professional life through higher education with support from all of those around me, and reflecting on the contrast of the different lives that women lead around the world. And I think these two papers are a reminder to us as we do seek to move forward about being particularly conscious of the differentiations of women, not only between the North and the South, but within our own communities in terms of the inequalities that exist by virtue of a whole range of intersections of our lives as women. So that's my introduction to what are two very powerful papers, and I'll come back to you after we've heard them. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sanam. I'm a PhD candidate for the University of Melbourne, and I'm presenting on my paper, Defending Beijing and Building a New Feminist Agenda. Today, the Beijing Platform for Action seems not only very progressive, but also impossible to replicate in the current geopolitical climate. Feminist activists who were present in 1995 have expressed that they expected Beijing to be the stepping stone, and instead it has become the ceiling, the limit to what governments will agree to, and has pushed progressive feminist groups to be defensive of the 1995 commitments. In the most recent reviews, civil society was often excluded, and the resulting political declarations lacked serious commitment. The declaration adopted in 2020 was so limited that feminist movements chose to draft their own feminist declaration. This is in stark contrast to 1995, where although there were gaps and challenges for many constituencies, on the whole, civil society was able to help shape the text of the declaration and the platform for action. The political context in 2020 is marked by rising authoritarianism, disinformation, strengthened extremist groups, and continued attack on multilateralism. Discussion and analysis on what should be feminist praxis are not taking place in the intergovernmental spaces, nor in many national contexts, due to the constant battle of holding on to the few gains made in Beijing. The real threat of backsliding, combined with the effort to try and find middle ground, has meant that feminist movements are constantly running a mile a minute to stay in the same place. This defensive struggle has been taking place as feminist movements have seen funding cuts over the years. 2019, following calls for a fifth World Conference on Women, UN Women initiated a hybrid conference, the Gender Equality Forum, which later was confirmed as the Generation Equality Forum. Originally meant to be hosted in 2020 by Mexico and France, this is not necessarily a new feminist agenda, but a strategy to move away from the quagmire of intergovernmental spaces where consensus building has been eroding existing commitments. The Generation Equality Forum has formed 6 thematic action coalitions, bringing together governments, donors, private sector, and civil society, attempting a different kind of modality. The Generation Equality Forum, while innovative in its approach, would still not match the previous World Conferences on Women in numbers of participants. In the context of the pandemic, it is also difficult to move ahead with the original plans of bringing together women's organizations, especially when many are now subsumed in frontline response work. Feminists have expressed the need for a systems change approach and a rejection of silos that are created and reinforced both by progressive and regressive governments and stakeholders. For a new, progressive feminist agenda, it is vital to support movements worldwide to both have their own space to strategize and to give way in intergovernmental spaces where civil society has been kept out of decision-making for too long. And I think that's 3 minutes. Thank you for listening.
Greetings from India. The topic of my today's presentation is At Beijing 25+, Battling the Backlash in the Post-COVID World, a Perspective from the Third World. In this paper, I interrogate the global women's human rights paradigm as envisioned under the Beijing Platform for Action from my location as a feminist researcher and practitioner located in the Global South, connecting it with the ground realities here. At the outset, I convey that 25 years back, an extraordinary event took place that has created a space for women's human right. This framework of right reaffirmed commitment to equality, justice, and liberty. Indeed, the language of right and justice has raised the hope and optimism to transform women's lives all over. However, when I locate this framework in the Global South, I realize that the narratives of progress are interwoven with the realities of oppression. At the ground level, the advancement made seems illusory. In the context of backlash, I raised 3 questions in this paper. First, I argue that the agenda of neoliberalism clubbed with the politics of backsliding against women's human rights is leading to harsher penalties for the poorest of poor women in the Global South, thus challenging the assumption that women's rights are universal, neutral, and inclusive. Second, I contextualize the scenario of backlash that arise because of tyrannical regimes that are impacting women's rights all over. And third, question visualize how the discourse on global women's human rights is otherizing the third world woman. My first core argument relates to the human rights in the context of neoliberalism. The women's human rights framework is about utopian goals of achieving equality, but this discourse is accompanied by the politics of neoliberalism that is aimed to ravage the human spirit by extending the old models of exploitation, as evident by the forceful implementation of structural adjustment programs in the Global South. This exploitative agenda is enforcing devastation and during the welfare regime in the third world countries. Besides many fallout of the neoliberal economy, the most disastrous impact of the devastation became evident during the outbreak of COVID-19. The pandemic has exposed a big divide in terms of access to food and healthcare. Several tragic pictures emerged from India where millions of informal workers walked thousands of miles to reach back to their homes. Most affected of these lots are women and children. The pictures that emerged revealed that the neoliberal economy as an ideology has venerated market and stripped away everything that makes us human. The situation of frontline health activists also faltered because of the health infrastructure under the free market approach led to the situation where those who catered to the health needs of marginalized remained underpaid. They lack social security and most importantly, they suffer due to absence of basic health protective tools. During COVID-19, this led them to go on strike. So in the imagery of the global rights paradigm, many of women from the global south could not find any place and are compelled to face harsher penalties due to economic reforms. My second argument is about many forms of backlash that emerge against women's human rights at the global level. The rise in authoritarian regimes are making severe impacts on the advancement made in the field of women's human rights. The backlash is shrinking the space for resistance, diluting the vocabulary of rights, weakening the legal protections, affecting the support system, increasing the control over women's life, leading to lesser fund allocation, and threatening women's safety in all other ways. My third argument is about otherization of the women in third world that continued in the 21st century. And no, I'm not talking about the recent developments, but about the backlash that evokes the argument of culture to promote Western supremacy while painting the third world countries as barbaric, illiberal, and inferior. The governments world over are not utilizing the parameters of universality or equality. Rather, the states are using the prism of colonial, neo-colonial, oriental, and cultural stereotypes in lawmaking and policymaking process. I have given examples in the paper, which I'm not repeating here. So what solutions I see to promote feminist agenda is to push for backlash against backlash. To counter backlash is to imagine a strategy to promote a right-based justice paradigm while connecting it to the realities of billions of women. This paper proposed to highlight the need to utilize multiple axis intersectionality approach while using the framework of equality, rights, liberty, and justice to disrupt the binaries of public versus private, religious versus secular, modern versus traditional, human rights versus neoliberal discourse, and to resist strongly while developing solidarity, building alliances and forging networks, using the vocabulary of women's human rights. So let us resist against every backlash, against every threat, every movement to imagine and reimagine the better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanam and Shalu, for those very thoughtful presentations and the more substantive papers which I have said I've had the opportunity to examine. And I'll do that first, but recognising that there is a theme to this session in relation to moving forward in an era of backlash. And it is a theme, I think, for the whole day in reflecting back on Beijing 25 years on, in thinking about the current political framework within which we, as individuals committed to gender equality, are working within. And I think that realisation is a sobering one, but also an empowering one of progressive change not always being a positive or increasingly positive progressive trajectory, that our journeys for change and for movement have swings and roundabouts that we as individuals need to build into our strategising in the ways in which we seek to promote change in a positive way for gender equality. And within that context, I think there are two themes that come out very strongly from these two papers. One of those themes is the importance of rethinking strategies of citizenship, strategies of participation of individuals wanting to encourage social and political and legal and foundational change to the frameworks within which we operate. And Sanam's paper does that squarely in relation to the movement, the feminist movement internationally. Her paper summarises some of the challenges, as we heard, that have emerged in the intergovernmental spaces on women's rights, and she examines how the successes from the Beijing Platform have in some ways limited progressive feminist movements, and her ideas are about how we engage the next agenda, taking from those experiences and using information that has been gathered. And Sanam has done that by virtue of her own experience, both on her personal observations from her 4 years of activity as a civil society organiser, involved in the regional and global feminist organising around the Beijing Plus 25 review. She did that as a chair of the Asia Pacific Civil Society Steering Committee and on the selection committee for the Generation Equality Civil Society Advisory Group, as well as a co-convener of the Women's Rights Caucus. And I think, again, benefiting from the lived experience of women activists, young women activists, as inspiring as these two women, reminds us that we are benefiting from that experience that they are bringing to the table, an intersectional experience, an experience that provides a diversity of their reactions to and responses to the existing framework and how to mobilise around that existing framework. And she speaks about the Generation Equality Forum as the new framework that evolved from the Gender Equality Forum, that is the structure within which movements today are needing to engage with. And I'll come back to that later in thinking through ways forward guided by her insights. But those ideas that she is proposing are for a new progressive agenda. And she's saying that it is vital to support movements worldwide, both to have their own space to strategise and to give way in the intergovernmental spaces where civil society has been negotiating in terms of being kept out and then being allowed in to what states are currently undertaking and the UN system is organising. So I'll come back to that citizenship point after I also engage with Shalu's very thoughtful paper with the three themes that you saw on that video that she very clearly articulated. The three themes, and the three themes start with neoliberalism, then looking at backlash in its multitude of forms, and then her very enlightening conception of otherisation that is going on in an international context. But it's the neoliberal aspect that I wanted to concentrate on here in relation to a link back, as she did in her own paper, as Shalu did. She also referred to the Susan Faludi book. And the link back to neoliberalism also links me back to the 15th anniversary of this book saw a new edition. And on the 15th anniversary of this edition, Susan Faludi wrote about something that she categorised as possibly even worse than the concept of backlash, and what she called were three golden apples. And I think these three golden apples link into the neoliberal point that Shalu very helpfully provides us. One is, and this obviously is from Susan Faludi's point of view, is from the global north, the notion of economic independence and how there had been a sense 15 years on from her book to economic independence in relation to women's development, but recognising that economic independence had actually led to a marketisation and a materialism that was undermining of women's humanity. The second idea that she said was that there was this empowerment of self-determination, but that again, in a neoliberal context, had been swallowed up with self-improvement. And the third was that notion of public agency that some women had gained, but that public agency again had been transformed into a concept of publicity. And Susan Faludi's call was to step beyond that neoliberal framework to call for a more responsible citizenship. And it's that more responsible citizenship that I think both of these papers very strongly and squarely call us to think through in terms of moving forward. And what does responsible citizenship mean for us as active citizens 25 years on from Beijing? And in this new role that I have as co-director with Trish Bergen of the 50/50 by 2030 Foundation, we are advocating that that responsible citizenship needs to be thought of in three contexts within the social frameworks of our society, both domestic and mostly domestically, in thinking back within the worlds and the communities that we live in. And those social frameworks speak back to the inequalities that still pervade and came up in the last session in the domestic realm in terms of the shared unpaid labour in the home, or the lack of the equality of shared unpaid labour in the home, and the need for us as feminists to be calling on men and women to readdress and advocate for that shared load in that domestic space, but also a sharing with governments of the responsibilities for childcare, for parental leave and framework that are so fundamental to enabling women to be active citizens. And that enabling is also important in an economic sense. And the other book that I just thought that I turned to in thinking through and reflecting on today's very powerful papers is this book by Frances Radai called Economic Woman: Gendering Inequality in the Age of Capital, which draws upon Frances's own involvement as a member of the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women Committee, and her role also as a special rapporteur in relation to reporting to the UN on women's participation in gender equality. And in her section of the book, in which she talks about the backlash in relation to the family and equality within the family and how that links in to and is a form of resistance to the international human rights agenda, she talks about a pathway to equality where we are encouraging both men and women to have equal opportunity to develop their caring responsibilities within the family alongside their fulfilling their potentials as economic actors. And that she advocates this would require the elimination of all legal, religious or customary regulation of the family, which discriminates against women or imposes patriarchal hierarchies in the family, or norms or divisions of responsibilities that undermine access to true equality for women. And I think in these last few minutes of this session, I think that those are powerful reminders of the domestic and the international. If I think back to where I was in 1995 as a young second-year lecturer in law at the University of Melbourne after having that wonderful graduate opportunity over in the US, my academic world at that stage was largely placed in the public law world. And I joined with the late and very dear friend of ours, Deborah Cass, in writing a piece about gender in the Australian Constitution. And it's from that I launched into my work on gender in an academic context and thought more about notions of membership and participation for women, both at the domestic level, but also fundamentally more so in the international level. And that brings me back to where I last saw many of you on the 13th of March of this year, where we held in Canberra, the 50/50 Foundation seized the moment CSW in Canberra when the CSW event in New York had been cancelled, where many of us, some of whom have been here today, gathered together to think through how we move forward in a post-COVID world. And that's essentially what we've all been doing today, I think very fruitfully and with a lot of passion and insight and thought. And I'd like to thank both of our presenters, Sanam and Shalu, for giving all of us the opportunity to think through how we do move forward in an era of backlash, but what I would say is an ever-present backlash or resistance, and one in which we must remain positive and thoughtful and encourage all of our colleagues to be active citizens as we move forward. Thank you.
Kim, thank you for that marvellous exploration of those papers, and I think you brought out some really interesting angles and linked them to your own marvellous work on citizenship. So I thought that was a particularly fruitful and rich way to take them, and thank you so much. I think that was modelling wonderful academic generosity, but really letting us see things that I certainly hadn't seen the first time in reading them. So many, many thanks, Kim.